Welcome to the discussion series on free trade and liberalization as part of the 1991 project at the Mercatus Center. I'm Shruti Rajagopalan, and in this conversation series, I will be talking trade with Professor Arvind Panagariya, who's the director of the Deepak and Neera Raj Center on Indian Economic Policies and the Jagdish Bhagwati Professor of Indian Political Economy at Columbia University. In the past, he has served as the first vice chairman of the Niti Aayog in Government of India and as the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank. He is the author of a number of books, but for today's conversation in particular, we will focus on his recent books, Free Trade and Prosperity and India, the Emerging Giant. Arvind, welcome back.
Thank you, Shruti. Glad to be with you.
So, taking off from our previous episode, Arvind, you told us in detail about the import licensing system. Can you walk us through what were the subsequent economic effects of this system, especially the long-lasting impact?
Excellent, Shruti. This is a very good place to start. The licensing system undermined both the productivity at the firm and industry level and the allocation of resources across industries. The effect was all around. As regards the productivity at the firm and industry level, there were delays in obtaining imported machinery and inputs. It would take 5 to 7 months for inputs, 1.5 years for capital goods and so forth. So that clearly impacted the productivity. There was unproductive use of resources. You had a big bureaucracy that had to be created to do the allocation. Entrepreneurs had to line up, wait outside the offices, wait for products to arrive and so forth. So there was these delays and unproductive use of resources themselves. Then there was inflexibility because of the unused capacity. If there are not enough inputs that required to be imported but are not allowed to be imported, then the excess capacity arises. Investment goes unused. Then there were also rules of thumbs used to make uniform allocations across firms and industries. And you can imagine that that is going to create a lot of inefficiency. Some firms are more productive, others are less productive. Some industries are more capable, others are less capable. And when you use these allocative rules, which are across the board, obviously you are not allocating in the most efficient sort of way. There was also, funny things that happened. Equipment would get imported, but if there are some components in the equipment which have only short life, like in the photography equipment, the bulbs that are required for photography, they have a limited life, they go off. Well, if you don't have the bulbs, the entire equipment becomes unused. So you've got that sort of problem. So that's one set of things that happened. Then competition, of course, got impacted as well because import competition was automatically shut off if you were going to produce anything domestically. This was pretty much protection on demand provided. But domestic competition was also strangulated because if you can't get foreign exchange for machinery, then competitor cannot enter the market. So you do that, you kill that competition as well. And finally, misallocation of resources, because at a broad level, if you look at the full picture, obviously there was a huge anti-export bias created here, both because of nominal exchange rate, because the price levels domestically rose much more. Therefore, domestic market obviously becomes more lucrative than the foreign market. Real exchange rate appreciates. So all that created a discrimination against exports as well. And then it's also in terms of the allocation, efficient and inefficient firms got treated pretty much equally. So there was no way for more efficient firms to outdo the inefficient ones because they both get equal access to the inputs. And so that clearly allows the inefficient firms to survive as well. So these are various ways in which, inefficiencies cropped up, productivity falling, resources being misallocated.
Normally people think that this kind of restrictive import licensing system only impacts imports and, many of the economic effects that you talked about. But it also actually impacts exports, and not just in a positive way, but adversely. So can you walk us through how India's restrictive import licensing system actually also impacted India's both exports and therefore the export policy regime?
Correct. So, this is all the joint impact of many interventions that we were doing. But in a very simple sort of way, you see, what happens is that inevitably, when you're restricting imports, that means that you do not need as much foreign exchange as you would if imports were open. What that does is it causes the domestic currency to appreciate, right? That this reduces the value of the foreign currency, increases the value of the domestic currency, and that's one kind of mechanism through which this happens. Typically, import restrictions cause the domestic currency to appreciate in real terms. And of course, an appreciated currency in real terms means that your returns to exports are low and your returns to domestic sales are high. So automatically products get channeled to the domestic sales, domestic market. Now, this got reinforced, by the way, by a very fixed nominal exchange rate. This was a time, when the international monetary system had adopted fixed exchange rates. But for the developing countries, it would have been prudent. As for example, South Korea in the early 1960s very quickly undertook very large devaluations of its currency won. And that actually, because also South Korea didn't have our kind of licensing and the focus on heavy industries and so forth. So there was internal flexibility as well. So that devaluation really made the exports very lucrative. And very quickly, you see in the early 60s, Korea's light manufacturing exports take off in a very big way. And you see the composition of the export shifting away from agriculture towards these manufacturers. But in our system, we didn't devalue, for one thing. We discussed earlier the 1958 episode when there was the kind of balance of payments crisis, but we tried to deal with it through this foreign exchange budgeting.
Yeah.
So that clearly put a break to the exchange rate. And once again, we come to the 60s and all also, same issue remains that, remember that even if inflation is 5% a year, in 15 years, prices double at home.
Yeah.
Right. And if your exchange rate, nominal exchange rate is fixed, then for $1 worth of exports, if you're previously getting, our exchange rate was 4 rupees 76 paise. So you're still continuing to get 4 rupees 76 paise for each dollar's worth of exports.
Yeah.
But the domestic prices have doubled, your profitability domestically has doubled. So you sell at home. So you see this import restriction automatically turns into an export restriction. In a technical terms, of course, we also have, you would know that this theorem we call the Lerner symmetry theorem, which effectively says that, look, if you impose 10% across the board tariff on every product, that will have the effect which is exactly identical to a 10% export tax. And where this theorem comes from is the fact that, when you impose this 10% across the board import tariff, you're importing less. well, then there is a need for export declines correspondingly. So correspondingly, your exports decline also.
So basically, there are so many things which are entangled here, but all of it comes down to the principal point of the original problem of an autarkic regime, right? The moment you decide to close yourself up to trade, it becomes very difficult to pick and choose that, these are the areas where we'll participate and benefit from the gains of trade. And these are the areas where, we won't participate and will protect us from the problems of trade or competition or something like that. If you engage in one, you get the other, right? And that seems to be the more universal principle. And no matter which country seems to have tried this highly restrictive autarkic regime, they kill their domestic economy exactly because of what you said, and some of this is because of import licensing restrictions. Some of it is because of the way the foreign exchange is pegged. But eventually the entire system has to make sense. And exports and domestic production seems to be the sacrifice that is made to keep the system intact.
Yeah, no, yes. And in our case, of course, it also got entangled by the domestic interventions because the government was trying to also achieve a particular mix of production, very, focused into heavy industries. So which could not be competitive for sure. We just didn't have the competitive advantage in those industries. So our cost of production domestically was much higher than what it was of the other producers abroad. Yeah. So we couldn't compete there. At the same time, where we did have comparative advantages were labor-intensive products that we then were forced to kind of push into these cottage industries, very tiny units. So we couldn't compete there either. So it really kind of interventions at multiple points, and at all points, ultimately inefficiencies arose.
So, this may be a good point for you to tell us how a country can simultaneously have an anti-export bias, but also have export subsidies as a very large part of its, policy program, which benefits certain groups. Now, the two seem antithetical. It doesn't seem reasonable, but in fact, both of them, if I understand correctly from your work, are unintended consequences of the same restrictive import system and the autarkic system. So how do both of these exist at the same time in a country like India in the 50s and 60s?
So yeah, so that I think this is a good point at which we can try to shift a little bit to look at the export policy as it was practiced during the 50s and at least parts of 60s. So first and foremost, I think what we need to recognize is the fact that by now we know actually that the exports suffered during these years. And one kind of measure of that is that India's share in the global economy, which was a little about 2.5%. So India's exports as a proportion of the total world exports was a little more than 2.5% in about 1947. And by 1966, it had dropped to below 1%, about 0.9%. So clearly, relative to the global economy, we did very badly in terms of exports. And that share never recovered for a very long time. Even today, I mean, after 91, we liberalized and all, but even today, our share in the merchandise exports still about 1.7%. So we are better than 0.9, but we haven't gone back to the 2.5 still. Now, large part of it, of course, happened because the exports in the global economy rose much more rapidly. These are years, 48 to 1960. The global exports were rising at 7% a year. India's exports rose only 1.6% a year during that 12-year period. So share naturally declined. And that more or less continued into the 60s as well, 61 to 66. Global exports rose 8.2%, India's rose only 3.4%. So the share largely kind of declined because, I mean, it's not like in absolute terms, India's exports were declining, but they were declining relative to the world exports. And by the way, that poor performance of exports evidently fed back into the import policy, because then you don't have foreign exchange, you got fixed exchange rate. Only way you can then deal with your balance of payments is through restricting imports. So that was the feedback that was happening. Now, on the export side, in the 50s, actually, we not only were actually indifferent towards exports. The attitude generally was one of indifference. If you look at all the debates that happened in 1955, around the second five-year plan, Malinobise's model, all that, there's basically an attitude of benign neglect. Nobody is paying any attention. The assumption is that we are an autarkic economy, that there's no trade. Even Malinobise's model itself strictly assumes that the economy is completely closed. So that was, but actually, in terms of policy-wise, we did even worse, because it was not pure benign neglect. It was actually one of abuse of export policy, because we actually imposed restrictions, both physical restrictions on exports, and we used export taxes. Now here, there's this book that everybody refers to by Dr. Manmohan Singh, our former prime minister and also the finance minister from 91 to 96. He had written his PhD thesis on India's exports in 1962 at Cambridge, which later on came out in 1964 as a book. And it's very nice analysis. He doesn't talk much, or almost, he doesn't talk at all about the imports, only focuses on the exports. So the book's title also reflects that, I have it here. It's titled as India's Export Trends. So he only talks about exports, but there he documents that, most of our exports were very traditional. Things like jute manufacturers, tea, cotton piece goods, iron ore, manganese ore, largely, very little of manufacturers, only cotton, that was our long-standing industry, which had acquired some efficiency and so it had acquired export markets. But we were neglecting it at the time, but it's still, because of its history, was surviving. Now, what we did, however, during this period was also to use these export restrictions. And Dr. Manmohan Singh really describes that, look, this is even in the medium run, this is self-defeating, because even when you have very large share, what happens is that when you restrict, it opens the door to the competitors. Yeah. Because obviously when you restrict, you are using your market power to raise the price at which price that you can get for your exports.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is what a monopolist always does. But that rise in the price also serves as an incentive to other competitors who were previously inefficient, but now they are able to compete. So they enter the market. And so, within a few years, they beat you. and likewise, he said, export taxes have a kind of similar kind of impact. Same thing, it's your export taxes are also restricting exports. Countries also, the importing countries, when they are faced with, restrictions on exports by the exporting country, they begin to look for alternatives. Yeah. So both ways, they look for alternative suppliers of the same product, but they also begin looking for substitute products. Yeah. Right. So, eventually plastics, etc., came to replace the jute manufacturers. Right. I mean, a lot of the things for which jute was being used, then plastic bags came in and they replaced. So So there are these substitutes that come in. So there's a very nice rendition of this in his book, saying that, look, these export restrictions are self-defeating, harmful. So because of this, by early 60s, we began to see that there's a problem on the export side. Exports are declining. Something needs to be done. So what do we do? Well, we go back and introduce export subsidies to some products. But that also, what we are trying to do is particularly things like chemicals and engineering goods. That is what we are, so we say, well, this is what we are going to, this is what we want to export. And of course, with high enough subsidy, you can become an exporter of the products to some degree. And so engineering goods did begin to emerge as export items. But actually, if you look at the full, composition of exports, even till as late as 1965-66, your traditional exports, top three, jute manufacturers was your top export, tea was the next, and then cotton piece goods. So these are clothing, etc. And probably they also include the fabrics. In the Indian classification, we often also in the past used to club both clothing and other textiles into the one category. So if you take those three, they accounted for more than 50% of the exports till at least 60-61. Even as you get to 65-66, when the engineering goods have begun to emerge, you have almost like about over 40% of the products, 40% of the exports are accounted for by these three, the traditional ones. So the subsidies in the end, and so export subsidies in the end, could only do so much. Ultimately, the nominal exchange rate was so overvalued that, and in some cases, these subsidies were very large. Bhagwati and Desai book gives you, the estimate, what these subsidies were as a proportion of the price of the product. And in some cases, these subsidies really rise well above 50%, which is not surprising given the fact that the nominal exchange rate was was fixed, and therefore the real exchange rate was so overvalued. So various kinds of instruments were but what happened over this time, that in the world market we lost share. I mean, we thought that we will, but even in value terms, right? Because you're trying to, like things like jute and tea, you're trying to get market power, right? So if market power is effective, at least in value terms, your export share should be rising, but it actually fell. So, in jute, we went from something like 86% in 1951 to 73% by 1960. In tea, we had almost 49%, around 48 to 50, fell to 43%, 58 to 60. So, the shares actually, even where we were so large, began to shrink. Cotton textiles also, we lost the market. So
something interesting is also going on in the rest of the world, right? So one is, of course, as you talk about, our shares are declining as a share of global trade. But the size of global trade itself is increasing in post-war years, right? So post-war, the developed countries see for maybe 2.5 to 3 decades, the longest, peacetime growth that has probably ever been seen in history. So those countries are growing. Now, a lot of the goods that were diverted in terms of demand for war goods, right? And I can imagine jute being one of those, between the 2 world wars and in the immediate post-colonial period, I can imagine a lot of packaging material, moving material being a requirement. But you see that after 1950, in the developed world, most of the trade starts shifting more and more towards demand for consumer goods, which is something India is simply not making, whether it is for its domestic consumers or for people abroad, right? It is still very much going along as if there's a colonial government extracting, iron ore and manganese ore, or, you're basically sending out raw materials or tea. It just hasn't somehow adapted to where the new world is going and what people seem to want to spend their money on.
Yeah, No, this was kind of foretold, right? Because the other development literature is telling you that primary products have these low income and price elasticities. That as incomes rise there,
Yeah.
the demand will automatically shift towards manufacturers, largely these consumer goods. But also price elasticity is high on those products, but very
Yeah.
low on these traditional primary products. So even if you try to export a lot, and this is where Jagdish Bhagwati's famous paper on emiscerizing growth comes in,
Exactly.
right? Saying that even if you raise productivity, even if you do investments, and you try to export a lot more of these primary products, the price will drop so much. And we, by the way, also face it today. We are
Yeah.
in agriculture continuously trying to raise the output, but
Yeah.
where can you sell this agricultural output? Price elasticity is extremely low. So at
Yeah.
the end of the day, you can't do a whole lot of good by raising the output of these food grains, etc., through MSP. You raise the price. You raise the output through
Yeah.
MSP, but in the market, the price will drop. So, for those who have farmers who have to sell their product produce in the market, basically will be wiped out. So
Yeah.
it is, and what we were doing was, trying to go into heavy industry where we could not succeed in the global marketplace.
Yeah.
And so therefore, and we haven't got the consumer goods manufacturers where South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore are succeeding big time. Hong Kong, they're all succeeding big time, in the 60s. But we are not, because those are not the products we are doing. So very much self-defeating. But at the time, now this is all hindsight. We can go back and do the analysis. But at the time, there was no, this preoccupation that we are going to be powerhouses of engineering goods and chemical and products and so forth is so strong at the time. Nobody's thinking actually of the light manufacturers in India. Even when it comes to subsidies, it's not the export subsidies. It's not the clothing and the textiles that are getting the subsidy. It's engineering goods and chemical products which are getting the subsidy. But very limited success, and that of course eventually gets us into a problem. You would remember, the crisis, balance of payments crisis that we had finally in the mid 60s.
That's actually a good, this is the first balance of payments crisis we spoke about last time. This was going on in 1958, which led to this foreign exchange budgeting sort of system. Now, the crisis in the mid 60s is a little bit different. So first, can you just walk us through what led to this balance of payments crisis in the 60s?
Yeah, certainly. So look, first of all, we might want to ask a question here: that could things have been different, right? As I mentioned, Dr. Manmohan Singh's book really did recommend that evaluation, and he then said, look, there was a lot of concern still, because, and to be fair, in the academic literature, there was a lot of this elasticity pessimism. Which was that if you devalue, if you have a lot of market power in products, which arguably was there in the Indian case in things like jute and tea, etc., then your terms of trade in those products will really get worse, right? That when you devalue, say exchange rate goes from 5 rupees to 8 rupees per dollar, that will create an incentive for these exporters to export more. And that will simply, because of the low demand elasticity, depress the prices. So he said that, okay, where in whatever commodities you have that problem, put a modest export tax, but otherwise you devalue and you don't need to do any subsidies. That was his recommendation. Largely kind of thing did happen later in 1966. We'll come to that. But a good question at this point is that, suppose this devaluation had been done earlier or something, could things have been very different? And my kind of conclusion here is that, some difference we could have made, and I've said before that 1958 was a good time at that time, could have changed. But unless we were willing to change the industrial structure itself, unless we were willing to go back to kind of doing consumer goods industries, light manufacturers, and move away from this heavy industry approach, in the end we couldn't have succeeded. So the failure, as we will discuss in 1966, to some degree was related to the fact that ultimately we were not willing to change the industry structure. If industry structure remains in that you're trying to go into products in which you don't have a comparative advantage, then this problem, the fundamental problem really remains, that your production structure is out of whack with your endowment, factor endowment. You are a very labor abundant country, but you're trying to do highly capital intensive industries. And that kind of always creates a tension. So in a big way, we couldn't have solved the problem. And as you can see, we are still struggling with that problem after 30 years of reforms. We are still struggling with that problem.
But
and this is
that
why,
seems
ultimately,
to me. But that seems to me not just a problem of, import policy or export policy or industrial policy as specifics. That to me seems a problem of the government simply cannot have such a large imprint on the economic system because it won't be able to calculate effectively and mimic what the market would do in terms of sending resources to their highest productive use. So the problem is even more fundamental, right? Like what you're saying is not only is there no simple fix and it has to fix the way it looks at industry, I would take two steps back and say it has to relook entirely at the way it thinks about the economy and the way it thinks about people, and whether a mixed economic system under socialist planning with the planning commission is actually the correct way to go, or they just need to abandon that wholesale.
Right. But this is all connected. This is all connected that, if you are willing to accept that, look, my comparative advantage is in labor intensive industries and I should let the structure shift back towards those industries, then what you are saying will follow. I mean, this is where, Bhagwati and Desai's 1970 book says that, look, you did not need to have this licensing across the board on everything. And you did not need to have these import controls through licensing. Is it, use tariffs if you wish to on import, but otherwise let them come in. Use the exchange rate. And if there are certain products which are absolutely desirable for the economy to produce, just do some bit of investment licensing on those products and leave the rest free. Don't, so that, and in fact, so if you really look at that book, it's very much written during the political economy context of the time, right? It's not, they're not saying that, let the markets rip or something, it's not the, it is not written at all in that kind of spirit. They see the political economy and so forth. And so what you are saying is roughly what Bhagwati and Desai book kind of says, that, look, this intervention anywhere and everywhere is the problem. So if there was a willingness to let the industry structure shift towards consumer goods, then what you are saying in terms of reduced interventions in the system would have followed. I mean, then you would not have needed to, plan every single industry in that way. I mean, you're precisely trying to produce things that market will not tell you to produce, which forces then your hand to impose investment licensing. So
no. And so now that, the systemic solution was not a possibility, and that was simply not at the time being discussed as something to be done. Like, even globally, even within India, though there were specific suggestions like the one Dr. Manmohan Singh gave, of course, in later years, Bhagwati and Desai come up with a much, much clearer, stronger critique of the system. But at the time of, say, the early 60s, other than devaluation, what were the possibilities? And second, what actually was the crisis that led to a point of devaluation that had to be done in 66. What was going on then?
Right. Yeah, you see, so now by 60s, sort of dissatisfaction emerges from the industry. Because you see, 50s was easier period. Number one, foreign exchange control was not there, till 58 at least. Licensing system, the bureaucracy could still deal with it because relatively few projects, capital was limited anyway. So, and the signals went out that, look, chemical industry is what the government is trying to develop, heavy industries, steel, etc. So industrialists also know what to apply for in terms of the license, and things have. But after this foreign exchange budgeting was adopted, then the system began to become complex. And by 60s, 63, 64, you begin to see a proliferation of these committees, about licensing, right? What to do, because big backlog comes in. Also, the economy has grown a little larger. So more applications are coming. And the numbers, some of these numbers are given in my book, India, the Emerging Giant.
Yeah.
The license applications rise in numbers and all. And the bureaucracy is not able to deal with it, at least expeditiously. So delays become endemic. And that leads the government to appoint a number of countries. There was a Swaminathan committee, there was a Hazari committee, there was 4 or 5 of these committees, these reports coming. But the tragedy, of course, is that none of those reports is saying, do away with licensing or do away with substantial part of licensing, put licensing in certain sectors and leave the rest. They're not saying that, they're just focusing on how I can improve the processes so that the licenses can be issued more rapidly. So these committee reports all kind of focus on, and they, painstakingly even record all the delays that are happening and all. So Bhagwati and Desai book reports many of these. In what sector, how much delay was happening, and how much of it was happening where, how was, so it's all documented now. But the point was that the system was not thinking in terms of giving up the basic structure, either in terms of production or in terms of the policy regime. It is not willing to give that up. And so the crisis kept growing up. So number of things happened, First of all, the agricultural performance, which was kind of at least flat from 60, 61 to 63, 64. These are the first 4 years of the 1960s. But there was then a bumper crop for 1 year, 64, 65. After which, there was drought. There were 2 back-to-back big droughts, 65, 66, 66, 67. So those droughts actually play a very critical role. 566 drought particularly. And so remember this 65, 66 financial year is fully ending at the end of March 1966, and the devaluation happened in June 1966. So this drought really played a very important role, because trade being so little, the industrial economy was also very tied into the agricultural economy. And so the drought automatically impacted the industrial economy also. Alongside, the export performance was getting worse and worse. In terms of the proportion of exports in GDP, that was 3.7% in 1966-61, already low. It fell to 2.9% by 65-66. So your export revenues are declining badly. Rising public expenditures were being financed by foreign borrowing and money creation. So you're borrowing abroad, your debt servicing ratios are rising. Exports, a large part of the exports is being taken away by debt servicing, the interest and principal that you have to pay back. And exports themselves are declining. They fall to 2.9% of the GDP by 65-66. So that puts the pressure. Then partly you're doing money creation. Money creation is raising domestic prices. So again, domestic market is becoming more lucrative. So you want to stay away from exports, sell in the domestic market. Um, so public investment was rising here as well. It rose 11.2% annually from 62 to 66. And by 1965-66, public fixed investment alone was close to 10% of the GDP, very large. So public sector was sucking up these resources, and current expenditures were rising of the government. China war happened, which led to the defense expenditures to rise. It's unthinkable today to get to that level, but it used to be 2% of GDP in 1961, became 4% by 1965-66. So today we are still not at 4%. We are well below. So consolidated fiscal deficit rose from 5.6% of GDP in 60-61 to 6.7% in 65-66. Loans abroad, even exclude your PL 480, that was kind of like aid.
Yeah, that's
so
aid.
Even excluding that, so excluding that, the loans that you are taking borrowing abroad increased from 1.4% of GDP in 60-61 to 2.4% in 65-66. That service ratio, this is what I mentioned, exports as a proportion, the debt service, meaning interest and principal paid on foreign debt as a proportion of your total export earnings, were already 21% in 66-67.
Yeah.
Now, 1/5 of such small export earnings are being taken away there. What do you do for imports? So you're clearly moving. This is exactly the kind of thing that was happening, very similar in 90, which led to 91 balance of payments crisis. So it was very classic kind of, balance of payments crisis that you observe with fixed exchange rate systems, which don't respond by devaluation and continue to domestically inflate the economy. I mean, this is a perfect kind of medicine for, or you can call it poison, if you wish, for the balance of payments crisis. So this was being seen, and you remember all the episodes about India having to live ship to mouth policy of Lyndon B. Johnson at that time, and so the US is also getting impatient. And it's got some power because India is having a problem. It has to get the food grade from him. So they were seeing that the crisis is brewing, and the US was very kind of also by this time realizing that heavy industry was the wrong thing to do. It wanted India to pay much greater attention to agriculture, and so it got the World Bank to come in here, and in September '64. The Aid India Consortium, was very alarmed, and they appointed this man called Bernard Bell.
The Bell Mission.
The Bell Mission. So they came, studied on, from the World Bank. They studied the situation and asked, they made policy recommendations. And so they went and said, look, you have to shift away from heavy industry to agriculture. And of course, a very integral part of their package was this devaluation of the rupee. And they also said, put an end to licensing of imports of at least intermediate inputs. So they said you can keep the licensing on the capital goods and consumer goods, but intermediate inputs, and sensible because if you got this capacity that is unutilized. It makes, because you're not allowing enough intermediate inputs to be imported, that's a loss to the economy. So in principle, this is a correct kind of recommendation. But then a part of the package was also a substantial non-project aid for maintenance imports. Now, part of the failure also happened, by the way, because that aid actually never came. And Vijay Joshi and Ian Little wrote a thick book in 1994 on India's macro, where they cover this crisis in great detail. It's a very nice history actually of India's macroeconomy up to about 91. And the reforms and post 91 they pick up in the next book that they wrote together. That was a shorter book. But that book, they said that according to their sources, the government of India was expecting about $900 million of non-project aid for maintenance imports for several years. But that never materialized. And that really infuriated the Indian government. And this is why they then also felt free to reverse some of the measures that they had initially taken at the recommendation of the Bell Commission. So Bell Commission also had said, put an end to export subsidies and to import licensing on intermediate inputs and substantial devaluation. Sorry, go ahead.
No, so, absolutely. And in our 1991 project, my colleague Prakhar Mishra, he has done a really detailed timeline of the 1966 devaluation. It's almost sort of like a mirror, right? The crisis is very similar to the one in 1991, what happened in 1966, but not with the same results. So he has a lovely paper, and the book that you're talking about, the Vijay Joshi book, we featured it on our website and our newsletter and so on. So everyone can, we'll put in a link and everyone can refer to it. But I want to also go back to the political situation within India, including sort of, the liberal voices, technical voices of economists and so on. When there was an attempt to devalue the rupee in 1966, most politicians, especially, important members in the cabinet, they were actually against it. Of course, the most staunch opposer of this was T.T. Krishnamachari. But there were a lot of people who were against the move. And even staunch liberals like from the Swatantra Party were not particularly in favor. And so what were the conditions under which this devaluation was implemented, though it was not exactly supported by the politics of the day?
Yeah, so there was no alternative, you could say it's a Tina factor at work. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, India was at this time very dependent on food imports from the United States. I think that was very critical factor in the whole thing. And the US clearly wanted this shift to happen, both towards agriculture and towards a more liberal regime and a movement away from this heavy industry. Now, by the way, US was also playing had played a very similar role earlier in South Korea. South Korea also, when they wrote their first plan in early 1960s, there was some bit of shift, proposals for a shift to heavy industry in South Korea. It never happened, but US also was kind of advising them against that, and US. So there was some bit of that earlier. Although, in fairness, as far as India was concerned, at that time, they were giving aid to India without saying that, the heavy industry is not the way to go. They actually supported at that time. And so it's not the case that their opposition to heavy industry in India had been there before. This is much later, but anyway, I think politically, you're absolutely right that there was no consequence whatsoever in favor of devaluation. And I doubt actually, that Manmohan Singh by that time was within the system, so we don't know. But what his view was, in a way, he has never said anything, at least to my knowledge, as to where, although his book clearly was quite favorable. So I would imagine that at least internally, he was voicing support for devaluation. But, politically, nothing, right? Because they had to bring Sachin Chaudhary was brought in, right, at the time, and he did the devaluation because TTK wouldn't go along with it, and lot of opposition was there. Now, again, to be fair, one must also acknowledge the fact that economists were not in favor either. It's not like economists were in any way supporting it. Jagdish Bhagwati certainly spoke positively, and I think Mrs. Gandhi
PR
did
Shenoy.
consult him. So he did, and certainly he was supportive. But the fact is that political support was simply not there. And economists were at that time very much into this elasticity pessimism, that devaluation, because the exports are so price inelastic, devaluation might end up hurting rather than helping. Right? There's a lot of that academic literature from that period, that when is devaluation effective? And we learned all about these Marshall-Lerner conditions, right? That, you know, some of the import elasticity should be bigger than one for the for the devaluation to be effective. And we felt that our products that we were actually exporting were not so price elastic, and also therefore will not get the balance of payments improvement. So to some degree, the economics was also helping the political class, which was opposed to it. And above all, I think, you know, in India, this was really seen as externally imposed on India. And that never goes well in India. You know, anything that is seen as externally imposed, it simply gets rejected by the public. And this is why, you know, 1991 reform was sold very carefully as India's own decision.
Homegrown,
homegrown, and that, you know, this was India's decision, not. And even in the way it was handled with the IMF and the World Bank was that, you know, we would send from our side the letter that this is our plan, this is what we plan to do. Right. And it's as though this is what we plan to do ourselves. If it fits into yours, then you give us the assistance. But, you know, so it's as if chronologically we are the ones taking the action, not rather than the IMF saying that if you do this, then we will, you know. So it was, but 66 was very clear. Bell mission had come in, report was given, the recommendation came clearly from outside.
And also credit where credit is due to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, right? In a sea of opinion where almost everyone was against the move, she was the one who had to, you know, decide whether or not they're going ahead with the devaluation. And, you know, she was in favor. I believe there was a meeting between Professor Jagdish Bhagwati and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and also K.N. Raj was consulted. And apparently, Professor Bhagwati gave details on, you know, not only must India devalue, but how much it should devalue. Are you privy to the details of this discussion at all?
No, I don't think the discussion was there. I doubt it. Discussion was more about, you know, she was asking, what do you think will happen? Do you think this will get the export response? That's my recollection from conversations with Jagdish. But I should check back with, you know, one of the things he always says while telling this story is that Mrs. Gandhi, you know, had the habit of keeping her head down, asking question, and then doodling in on her writing pad. But my recollection generally is that she was trying to feel out, you know, what the impact will be. Which was not easily predictable, frankly speaking, you know. But we can check. I'll check.
That must be such a nice thing to have to pop into the next office and ask Professor Bhagwati exactly what happened in 1966, which is lovely. But, you know, it's again, when we look back at that story, it's the usual suspects, right? It's B.R. Shenoy and T.N. Srinivasan, Jagdish Bhagwati, who've written extensively about this episode of devaluation before and after. But aside from that, you're right, you know, the general view of the economists is not in support. The general view of the politicians is not in support. It seems to be some compromise, you know, sort of like a Tina factor, which this whole devaluation is pushed through. But is this perhaps the reason that after the devaluation, the sort of liberalization one would have expected never really happened in India in 1966? Like in 1991, after the two-step devaluation in early July, there were a series of trade reforms and industrial licensing reforms and so on that were announced. This was that opportunity for India in the mid-60s, but it never quite worked out.
But you see, the problem there are multiple problems here. Why it could not have worked out. Uh, First and foremost, again, are we willing to let the industry structure be determined a lot more by the market forces?
Yeah.
I mean, that was the most crucial thing. Without that, there was no play. I mean, you will run into the same problems going forward. So
Yeah.
either you continuously keep tightening your import regime so that your balance of payments remain manageable, or the other alternative is to actually let go of the investment licensing, let the market decide what the people want, what are the products for which the actual demand exists. Without that, I don't think you could have succeeded. You see, this is why I also think that 91 reform, trade liberalization could not have succeeded unless we had, because we also gave up all the licensing, investment licensing at that time.
Yeah.
So there were multiple steps got taken which were essential. But if we were not prepared to do that, there was an extra problem actually in the mid 60s, which is the exchange rate. You have to be prepared to devalue more. And Shenoy, as you know, actually has written that that in his view, the failure was because the devaluation was too little. A much larger devaluation was needed. And I think he's right, because just think about it. The exchange rate, nominal exchange rate, had been fixed since what, 48 or 49, somewhere there, at 4 rupees 76 paise per dollar until 1966. You got practically almost 18, 19-year period.
Yeah.
And if your prices have more than doubled during that period domestically, and similar inflation has not happened abroad, then you have to devalue by much larger volume. You have to go to something like at least 10, 11, 12 rupees to the dollar. We went to only 7.5 rupees to the dollar.
Yeah.
So I sort of, broadly speaking, I agree with Shenoy's analysis that the devaluation itself was too little. But then I think Bhagwati and Srinivasan also point out that, so this was like, in terms of the value of the rupee, in terms of the dollar, fell by, devaluation meant that the value declined by 36.5%. That was the extent of devaluation, value of rupee, when you do the calculation going from 4.676 rupees to the dollar to 7.5 rupees to the dollar. That is a decline of 36.5% of rupees value in terms of the dollar. But the actual devaluation was even less, because many of the export subsidies were cut out, and import tariffs or import premium got reduced. Right. So both of those factors also contributed to the devaluation being less than this 36.5%. So actually Bhagwati and Desai, they give a calculation, and they say that effective devaluation turned out to be only 17.5% for exports, because if you were getting previously for each dollar's worth of exports, you are getting some subsidies also, which got taken out. So now for dollars worth, you are actually getting 7.5 rupees instead of 4.76 rupees. But then on top, whatever export subsidy you were getting on 4.76 rupees, let's say another 2 rupees, if that's taken out, then on net you have not got 7.5 rupees. The difference between 7.5 rupees to 4 rupees 76 paise. 2 rupees in between have also gone away. So whatever the extra is much less. That is their point. That the actual devaluation for exports on average was only 17.8% instead of 36.5%. And for imports, it was 29.7% instead of 36.5%. So Shana would say that you needed, anyway, much more devaluation, much larger. But what you got actually was not even 36.5%. So it was insufficient. Then the two back-to-back droughts further complicated this, right? Because June 66, the devaluation happens, but the drought is continuing. The entire year 66, 67, which means till March of 67, this drought is continuing. And so the prices are rising. Domestic prices are rising. And that rising domestic prices further undermining the devaluation, meaning, the domestic goods are becoming more lucrative now, even within a year of this. So it was a kind of, you could say it was a death foretold, meaning, that you could have expected that this is how it will turn out. At least, well, that's how it looks in hindsight,
And in the immediate aftermath, the cash subsidies, the import replenishments, all of these were brought back, reducing the effective devaluation. But how does this inform what is the trade policy that will follow? So you've devalued, you've obviously not devalued sufficiently. Now, what is a good way to think about how the policymakers at that time were thinking about trade policy post devaluation without implementing any liberalization reforms?
Right. So now, they begin to see the failure, right? So, which is that the exports have not responded. Now, it's not failure per se, actually, because it's failure because exports don't do better. But that doesn't mean devaluation failed, because exports would have done even worse. But that counterfactual nobody looks at. Nobody worries about the counterfactual. So you only look at, well, here is what was the exports before, and here are what the exports are after, and you say, oh, devaluation has failed. But of course, if we had not devalued, the crisis would have been even bigger. So devaluation didn't quite fail, but it's simply that it did not deliver the outcome that we needed, and that was not because the devaluation failed, but because devaluation was not large enough. And this withdrawal of export subsidies and import tariffs further undermined the effectiveness of the devaluation. So that's exactly what happened, which of course meant that any support that BAL mission package had disappeared very quickly. And so export subsidies did return, as you just mentioned. So we did not continue on the path to liberalization, because they said, well, what do? We got to now do something else to get more exports. And so export subsidies do come back. By 1970-71, the import controls were back in full swing, and even more stringent than they were prior to devaluation. So this is the conclusion of Joshi and Little, who say that, look, import controls by 70-71 were far more stringent now than they were even before, in terms of its implementation. And Bhagwati and Srinivasan kind of say that the combined export subsidy, as a result of these measures on some selected items, including engineering goods, chemical, plastics, and other new products. So they give these numbers, say that they were ranged something like between 50 to 90% on the effective ad valorem basis. So it's very large, It was on selected items, of course, they were trying to subsidize, traditional ones, they would always, elasticity pessimism always kept them more on the side of restraining the exports rather than stimulating. But on products like sports goods, paper products, processed foods, they tried to give subsidies, and these were between 50 to 90% of the effective ad valorem value of the products. So that's where we came back.
And, at the same time, earlier you had talked about how until there was a shift in industrial policy at home, there's only so much that all this devaluation and, the external sector reforms can work out or succeed. And what you see after 1967 is Mrs. Gandhi's government is now doubling down on socialism at home in a whole new way. Right. So it's doubling down on heavy industry. They're talking about commanding heights of the Indian economy. They're nationalizing general insurance. They're nationalizing coal mines, copper mines. There is a big wave further cementing India's heavy industry policy, which is at play. Simultaneously, because of all the union problems, there are hundreds of cotton textile mills which are now going broke. And not allowed to exit, right? So at that time, you have all these, sick textile mills, legislation which is passed. These are all nationalized by the government. The mills become defunct. So there is that problem going on simultaneously. And it seems like the Indian domestic economy is more restrictive than ever before, which means, all your import restrictions and export restrictions can't be that far behind when the situation at home has now doubled down even more on the bets that Nehru made.
Yeah. Now, so as we move forward in time, one might ask a good question, that if it was around, say, 1970 or a little later, if the similar crisis were to happen, not in 66, but a little later, would Mrs. Gandhi have devalued? And my guess is that she wouldn't have. See, 66, 67, she is a very new prime minister. Yeah. Right? It's January 1966. Lal Bahadur Shastri died in Tashkent, and she became the prime minister. And so, at that time, she is still very weak prime minister, if you will. Her own position is not so secure and all. But then by 70s, of course, she is she is in incredibly commanding position. Probably, at that point, she would have dealt with Lyndon Johnson very differently.
Well, she would have dealt with Lyndon Johnson differently. But, on the other hand, this is kind of, it's a little bit strange. When people become very dictatorial, then, they may also make bolder moves. So it's very difficult to predict the counterfactual when you have people in full dictatorial mode and have consolidated all power within their party, and, they're kind of ruling their cabinet. There's not too much opposition from their cabinet. So I feel like, with Mrs. Gandhi, it could have easily gone the other way also. I'm never able to predict.
Yeah, reason I say is that she was on very heavy socialist bench, right? So everything she was doing was moving towards more and more control.
Yeah, and P.N. Huxer is right now her chief advisor, and he really is following the Soviet Union playbook at this point.
Exactly. So this is why I think that is the direction she would have taken. The economy's direction is very clear around this time, so the clearly the consistent thing to do would be to then absolutely refuse to devalue and just double down on the controls and double down on the controls. Which they did.
And FERA, MRTP, everything becomes more restrictive, right? All these are also being amended simultaneously as the controls get heavier and heavier. More of the areas of activity are getting criminalized. It's becoming very difficult to do business internally and with players abroad if you're an Indian businessman around that time. And then, of course, emergency happens. And that's sort of the wildcard event that no one predicts. I imagine that, until the mid-1975, as the restrictions get more and more severe, and then the emergency when, the economy is almost in suspended play for a while, right? All major policy is not being thought out carefully. So then we get to the late 70s, and you've talked about how starting in the late 70s up to 1991, there is definitely a period where India starts thinking about relaxing restrictions. And then, of course, post 1991, we have like the really very bold sort of reforms. So I think this is a nice place to end now. And then the next time you can walk us through the late 70s, early 80s period of what's happening in India. How are we thinking about relaxing these very severe restrictions? What is the impact that leads us up to the 91 reforms?
I think so. Yeah. But let me just, say one final thing that that this kind of controls, the very severe control regime that came to be, had a major impact, So, so one measure that we conventionally use, the imports to GDP ratio, that really declined steadily, and one way to think of it is that in the 1950s, imports never fell below 5.5% of the GDP, right? And in fact, at peak in 57, 58, they were 9.3% of the GDP. So, roughly you can say between 5 and 10%. But by 1969, 70, imports as a proportion of GDP had fallen to 4%.
Yeah.
And a good part of it was probably also being spent at the time on food imports. So for the rest of it, so you can imagine how industry had to function because, there's so many raw materials, immediate imports, etc. that you need, but nothing doing, So even, till almost mid 70s, imports don't rise even to 5%. It's post mid 70s that some expansion happens. And that's, of course, is what we can discuss in the next episode. That how, what are the factors that led to some relaxation of the balance of payments constraint and so forth, which allowed for some bit of liberalization that happened beginning roughly the mid 70s.
Mid 70s. Yeah, no, I think that's a great plan. And I'm excited because as we get closer and closer to the liberalization episode and also more recent in time, I think it starts becoming visible that everything happening in India today is so tightly linked to, some of the measures that were taken in the 80s and 90s. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. But thank you so much, Arvind. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise. Good. Thank you, Shruti.